You know what the maddest she ever got at me was? One time she was watching this show, it was like a poor excuse for The View, and they started talking about domestic violence, right? For the 9 millionth time this year, they're talking about domestic violence. How do you not know not to do that? Do they really have to keep talking about it? So at the end of the hour, they come to the logical conclusion. They're like, there is no reason to hit a woman. There is no reason to hit a woman. And I was just like, really? I could give you like 17 right off the top of my head. You could wake me from a drunken stupor, I could still give you like 9. Dude, there's plenty of reasons to hit a woman. You just don't do it. But to sit there and suggest that there's no reason. Dude, the level of ego behind that statement. What are you, levitating above the rest of us? You're never annoying? Women, how many times have you thought about slapping your fucking guy in the head this week? Every day! There you go.
Good morning. It's Saturday, Enemies of My Country Saturday, January the 6th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have no free lunch, rules for radical conservatives, rules for retrogrades, rules for patriots, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, and the enemies of my country. All that and more when I get back.
God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I shouldn't change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen.
Thank you. And now there's no free lunch. 250 Economic Truths by David Bahnsen.
The question is not whether we wish to see everybody as well off as possible. Among men of goodwill, such an aim can be taken for granted. The real question concerns the proper means of achieving it. And in trying to answer this, we must never lose sight of a few elementary truisms. We cannot distribute more wealth than is created. We cannot, in the long run, pay labor as a whole more than it produces. Henry Hazlitt. This is human flourishing brought to the title of the book. My aim in promoting a free and virtuous society is the cause of human flourishing, and yet I do not advance that aim, only falsehood, by pretending that there is a free lunch out there. Once we accept the reality of trade-offs in our understanding of economics, we will not inhibit the cause of human flourishing. We will instead make it actually feasible.
And that was There's No Free Lunch by David Bahnsen. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for radical conservatives.
Our secret weapon, political correctness. From Woodrow Wilson to Franklin D. Roosevelt, to Jimmy Carter, to Bill Clinton, to Barack Hussein Obama, those of us on the left have steadily eroded your American notions of freedom, individual responsibility, civic autonomy, and free will, all in the name of protecting you from the terrors of the night. Think of us as Maria Ouspenskaya in one of the old Wolfman movies. warning a shivering Lon Chaney Jr. about the evils that dwell just beyond the edge of the forest. And then, stop believing in those evils. From a nation of free men and women who once crossed the Great Plains in prairie schooners, conquered the Rockies, sent whaling ships around the world, and rose to defend freedom wherever and whenever it was threatened by people like us, you have become a nation of sheep, cowering, disarmed, and unmanned in your homes, worrying about the children, which you don't have any of, since we have also convinced you that having kids is selfish, that we're destroying the planet with our very presence, that we have to reduce our carbon footprint. How I laugh every time I hear those words, since we are carbon-based life forms. And my own personal favorite, that it would be a crime to bring children into a world as horrid as this one. We have taught you to mistrust art by coarsening it and cheapening it, by offering you vulgar substitutes for what once were your staples, supplanting Shakespeare with vulgar reality shows as popular entertainment. Not that there's anything wrong with that. After all, the Bard was plenty vulgar in his time. Even better, we have gotten you to despise it, as our critical theory legion swept across your shores and taught your children to mistrust the wellsprings of their own nation and culture. Beethoven, when queried about the meaning of his piano sonata, Opus 31, No. 2, replied, "Read Shakespeare's Tempest." But of course you won't, because most of you no longer can. One of the reasons Shakespeare no longer means anything to you is that he is no longer politically correct. Yes, that's right. In the process of making you hate your own culture, which we may shorthand here as old, dead, white male culture, so you just know how socially unjust that must be, we've also rendered it politically incorrect for you to celebrate it, or soon enough, even to indulge in it. And here you thought that Ray Bradbury's famous book, Fahrenheit 451, not to be confused with our hero Michael Moore's anti-Bush propaganda movie, was a work of fiction. But make no mistake about it. Books will be burned, reading matter will be restricted, and speech will no longer be protected. It must be so. Why? Simple. For us to be able to control you, sheep, the last thing we can permit is your ability to think for yourself. If Walter Lippmann thought that the public opinion ought to be organized for the press rather than by the press, he was only dimly glimpsing the way forward. For he understood that some opinions should simply not be allowed to exist. There is no such thing as free speech. That was always a founding father chimera, an Enlightenment fantasy, a brief moment in time when the oceans kept Fortress America safe from the taste of our conformist lash. And it's high time you understood that. There is only acceptable speech and unacceptable speech. And as you can imagine, the latter is simply, unacceptable. Political correctness is, to put it bluntly, fascism of the mind. Our way of ostensibly protecting you from your own worst instincts, but really protecting ourselves from the consequences of your inadvertently articulating the truth. Of all the master's inventions, it is among the most brilliant. By imposing the scourge of political correctness upon your discourse, we have robbed you of the ability to speak and thus to think freely. You must now weigh every word you say against an imaginary standard of offense that constantly shifts. No matter how stupid or uneducated the individual, you must watch what you say, even to consigning unto Purta perfectly good English words that somehow might be misinterpreted by an idiot. In the guise of compassion, one of our favorite words, we have essentially deprived you of your own language and replaced it with one more to our liking. One, in other words, in which you can't criticize us. For as John Milton noted in the Areopagitica, freedom of speech goes hand in hand with freedom of thought, and indeed with all other freedoms. When you cannot call your tongue your own, then truly you possess nothing. Political correctness did not simply happen. It was not born out of some popular mandate or out of the collective unconscious, striving to rectify a past wrong. We made it happen. It came to you in the guise of a good thing. Who could object to inoffensiveness, to an unhostile workplace, a non-threatening atmosphere, a non-hurtful culture? Everything we do always seems so reasonable, does it not? And you bought it. It never occurred to you, so browbeaten had you become, that there is plenty to object to about inoffensiveness. Vigorous, bold, and, yes, offensive speech has been a hallmark of the American discourse since the frontier days. It used to be a staple of your political discourse as well. You used to be man and woman enough to take it and like it and give it back tenfold. That used to be a point of pride with you. And yet, we have convinced you that our way, the way of the weasel, the whiner, the tort lawyer, the talking head, the way of Ellsworth Toohey and the fountainhead, should be your way as well. Now self-censorship has tiptoed into your life, a vice cloaked as a virtue, just the way the master drew it up on the blackboard so long ago. If you don't mind me injecting a little anachronism in my pursuit of a cheap sports metaphor, for soon enough, sports metaphors will be just about the only ones you'll be able to understand. Imagine if I told you that you and your family were being attacked in your home by a gang of vicious thugs. These thugs had broken down your door and had driven you to the farthest back bedroom, where even now you are cowering in fear. Your youngest child is whimpering in terror. Your wife is having a nervous breakdown. And your teenage daughter does not at all like the way several of the thuggies have been looking at her. Now imagine that, amazingly for the kind of guy you are, the room in which you have taken refuge is in fact an armory. You don't know how all those weapons got in there, and Gaia forbid that you would ever use one of them. But there they are, locked and loaded and ready to do some serious damage to the home invaders. There's your ancient ancestor's harquebus, a muzzleloader from the First Revolutionary War, a Colt 1911 .45 semi-automatic pistol, a BAR, an M1, a grenade launcher, a Thompson submachine gun, a Barrett .50 caliber. Good Lord, man, you have enough weaponry and firepower to hold off an army. As the fists pound on the door and the axe begins to splinter the wood, your wife and kids are crying out to you to grab a weapon or two and at least fight back, if not actually put an end to the danger. But no, your nerve fails you. You cannot overcome some still, small, scared voice within you that says it is better to die on your knees than to stand and fight on your feet. You look at the guns, realize that they could possibly save you, and still you don't pick one up. Because to do so would be wrong. And so you die. This is what political correctness will do to you if you leave it unchecked and unchallenged. If that seems a little extravagant a claim for what is, after all, just being nice to people, think again. I can't emphasize this point enough. PC is fascism for the mind, a way of imprisoning you in an irrational and vulnerable land of what seems like happy talk and sweet thoughts, but is in reality the most vicious stalag you can possibly imagine. For once you have accepted the premise of PC speak, that there are some things you not only can't say, but can't even think, then you have capitulated in our assault upon you, and except for the terms of surrender, the war is over. First, let's look at what PC purports to be. The way it's sold to you as being reasonable, tolerant, and above all, fair. Political correctness posits that any form of speech that stereotypes, insults, or hurts other people ought to be refrained from, especially if there's another way of saying whatever it was that you wish to say. And who could be against that? Hurting other people is something we learn not to do in kindergarten, just like Robert Fulghum, who learned all he needed to know there and even wrote a bestseller about it. And so our natural instinct, ours I said, not yours, you racist redneck bigots, is to ameliorate our speech, so that in the immortal words of Rodney King, we can all just get along. Here he goes, I can hear you thinking, telling us that we ought to start using racial epithets and stuff to free our minds and express ourselves. And then when we do, the left can just laugh and point and call us bigoted redneck racists all over again, because we've just proved that everything they say about us is true. But that's not it at all. That's what we want you to think. What it really is a way for us to control not only your speech, in clear violation of the First Amendment, something for which we have very little use insofar as you are concerned,
And that was the first part of Chapter 15 from Rules for Radical Conservatives by David Kahane. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, rules for retrogrades. 40 tactics to defeat the radical left.
Rule 26. The retrograde must use Saul Alinsky's shrewdest, trickiest rules for radicals against the radicals themselves. We will examine how to specifically reverse 2 of his rules, 4 and 13. Respectively, these 2 rules read, make the enemy live up to his own book of rules, and pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. First, let's polarize Alinsky's Rule 4. Make the enemy live up to his own book of rules. Alinsky admits openly that he was inspired, naturally or supernaturally, by the tactics of the devil, who simply cherishes the contempt of hypocrisy. According to both scripture and tradition, Lucifer was and is fascinated by both the concept and the implementation of hypocrisy, employing it wherever opportune, on his own behalf, and pointing it out in others whenever expedient, which of course indicates his implementation of a sort of meta-hypocrisy, a hypocrisy within hypocrisy. No surprise, then, that Alinsky's favorite tactic involved decrying hypocrisy and anything else looking like hypocrisy in his political opponents. Every American general election cycle, radicals across the land furiously forage the political landscape for any and all indicia of the slightest instance of hypocrisy by the religious right, which they find, of course, since all humans make mistakes. What's truly diabolic in this modus operandi is the startling consequence that Americans have generally given purchase to the radical lie that an act of hypocrisy by Party A equates to an automatic score for his rival, Party B. Naturally, the consequence of unintelligent voter behavior continues to incentivize radicals to weaponize hypocrisy. We must turn the tide by making radicals meet muster, a double twist to be sure. In other words, force the enemy to live up to his own rules, about enemies living up to their own rules. In order to accomplish this, Christians must become more adept at weaponizing the radical concept of equality. Radical impunity against Christians, in the name of equality, violates justice. Retrogrades must resolve this abuse of so-called equality for themselves. For example, consider the radical community organizing effort from 2012 until 2017 that resulted in the temporary coercion of Christian bakers in Colorado to produce cakes for celebrants of homosexual civil unions, until the Court of Appeals holding was overturned in the Supreme Court in 2018 in favor of the bakeries. Supposedly value-neutral jurisprudence in America, such as the decidedly anti-Christian holding by the Court of Appeals, has never actually been neutral, notwithstanding its claims. Without other opinions, the retrograde must negate the enemy's legal tactics culturally. He must do this by showing that, one way or another, an immoral application of one of the rules for radicals against a Christian can easily be weaponized by that same Christian. In the absence of an eventual overturn by the Supreme Court, Christian bakers might have ironically employed Alinsky's Rule 4 by posting signs in their bakeries saying, all profits from wedding cakes for homosexual civil unions will be diverted exclusively to heteronormative religious causes. This would classify as a defensive tactic, as it rebuffs prospectively against enforceable requests by homosexuals for wedding cakes. Sure enough, between 2012 and 2017, Christian cake shops might have been legally required to violate their Christian scruples, but this way, at least they could use the profits to strike against the very occasion of the radicals' oppression. More importantly, their signs would likely have deterred homosexuals from requesting, i.e. requiring, them to provide such cakes. The radical insistence on a certain type of equality under the law would, in that case, work in favor of Christians for once. The Christian baker would have successfully reversed Alinsky's Rule 4, even in the face of legal defeat. Alinsky's Rule 13, being offensive rather than defensive, allows for a more aggressive response to the same circumstances. Pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Operating on the basis of Rule 13 from 2012 until 2017, the retrograde might have struck back, locating and then patronizing bakeries run by radical anti-Christian homosexualists and forcibly requesting Christian and heteronormative-themed wedding cakes. This would be the retrograde's more ambitious way of affirming the exclusivity of man-woman marriages. Pick the target, i.e., an opposition bakery, personalize the message, and polarize what they attempted to do to Christians. The radical left won't live and let live, so why should we? Forcible viewpoint discrimination in the realm of baker harassment cuts both ways, after all. The retrograde must see to it that it does. While the Supreme Court eventually rendered the issue moot in 2018, the hot-button issue of Christian bakeries and homosexual wedding cakes provided an excellent opportunity to exercise the retrograde's moral imagination. It will prove both necessary and worthwhile to anticipate what retrogrades may do, defensively and offensively, in a foreseeable day to come, when the ultimate holding may not be as innocuous to Christians as that rendered by Masterpiece Cake Shop versus Colorado Civil Rights Commission 2018. In practice, abiding this rule of Alinsky's 13 serves to cross-reference the rule for retrogrades enjoying a perennial offensive counterattack. The reader can plainly see how much more effective the offensive application of Alinsky's rules are than the defensive. Once more, always be on offense. When it comes to the
Excuse me, and that was Rule 26 of Rules for Retrogrades. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Rules for Patriots by Steve Deese.
Except Boehner and his enablers in the Republican caucus aren't soldiers. They're bureaucrats. The difference is a soldier takes territory, while a bureaucrat protects his own. We need more soldiers who inflict casualties upon the enemy because they don't stop shooting until the body stops twitching. Metaphorically speaking, of course. Soldiers don't negotiate with the enemy. They provoke him to surrender. When was the last time Boehner and his colleagues got the Democrats to surrender on anything? Heck, when was the last time the Republican Party's national leadership got the Democrats to surrender on anything for that matter? Our civilization doesn't have time to wait for Boehner and his colleagues to take the advice God once gave Job, and that's gird your loins like a man. If a man hasn't discovered his testicular fortitude by the time he's 62 years old, it's not likely to happen. We need to start replacing the Boehners of this world with soldiers. And soldiers know you never attack what you're not willing to kill. John McCain was once a soldier of tremendous valor. But over the course of his career in politics, he became a liberal media pandering maverick who went out of his way to betray conservatives and thus the country over and over again. One issue McCain did consistently fight on was pork barrel spending. Yet when the TARP, which pollster Scott Rasmussen says is the most unpopular legislation in recent history, emerged down the stretch of McCain's 2008 presidential run, he suspended his campaign to aid and abet the passage of the very kind of corrupt spending he fought against his entire career. Mitt Romney once had the brass tacks to make billion-dollar deals as a global financier without blinking, putting his and countless others' very livelihoods at stake each and every time. But he's run for office 4 times, and each time he ran as somebody totally different. In 1994, he ran for U.S. Senate in Massachusetts as anti-Reagan and to the left of Ted Kennedy on social issues. In 2002, Romney ran for governor of Massachusetts as a make-the-trains-run-on-time blue state Republican. His official portrait as governor depicts him signing into law Romneycare, which was the forerunner and blueprint for the Obamacare he now claims to oppose. In 2008, Romney ran for president as a Reagan conservative, trying to get to the right of Mike Huckabee despite his previous campaigns and record. In 2012, he ran for president as an establishment heir apparent. Pick a persona, Mitt, any persona. And some politicians wonder why they lack credibility with the American people. What's funny about Mitt McCain is that after spending their political careers pandering to liberals and selling out their base, once they secured the Republican presidential nomination, they ended up drowning in all the same haterade the liberal media labels any true conservative with. McCain was for Roe versus Wade most of his Senate career, including his 2000 presidential run, and has always been for government funding of embryonic stem cell research that pro-lifers oppose. A technology that is complete liberal mythology and has yet to save any lives, but has destroyed many. Nonetheless, all the pro-child killing groups were just as vociferous in characterizing McCain as anti-reproductive freedom as they would have been a lifelong Republican pro-lifer like a Huckabee. Romney's original tax plan was called timid by the conservative-leaning Wall Street Journal during the 2012 primary, and even included the very patronizing targeted tax cuts to appease the class warfare crowd the left often panders to. Yet all those same class warfare groups demagogued Romney for his wealth, see that as success, as they would have any rich white Republican like Steve Forbes, who actually advocated a ballsy overhaul of the liberals' entire tax and spend scheme when he ran for president. Remember when Romney got unfairly panned for his 47% comment? Turns out that's exactly what he ended up with in the 2012 popular vote. The Mitt McCains of the world waste their entire political careers declaring peace in our time with their enemy, desperately trying to show them they're not like those dastardly conservatives they despise. Then once they reach that summit, the liberal enemy they spent all those years pandering to pummels them with the same exact blitzkrieg of political propaganda they would pound any principled conservative with. In contrast to Mitt McCain are Ronald Reagan and Scott Walker. Former President Reagan attacked the Soviet Union with the intent to kill it. He didn't want to peacefully coexist with totalitarianism, nor regulate it incrementally out of existence. He wasn't satisfied with fewer nations under the Iron Curtain. He wanted to defeat it. Even over the objection of his own advisors, Reagan attacked the Soviet Union at its root, famously labeling the Soviet Union as the evil empire in a speech to the national religious broadcasters in his first term. With the aid of the late former British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher and the late Pope John Paul II, Reagan launched a full-scale Cold War to dismantle Sovietism. By the time Reagan left office, the Soviet Union's influence was declining, and the evil empire collapsed just 2 years later. Faced with presiding over the Midwest version of California, or total statewide insolvency, Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker did what the man who played the Terminator in the movies didn't have the guts to do when he was governor of a state going broke. Arnold Schwarzenegger issued IOUs to the taxpayers. Walker took on the government sector employee unions, who for too long had called the shots in state government at the expense of the taxpayers. He faced them down, even at the risk of his own recall, and he routed them. His goal wasn't to be a little less bankrupt or a little less ruled by the leftist mobocracy. His goal was to defeat them. Now, which type of leader would you rather have? Which type of leader do you think the American people need more of? Since today's American leftists have much in common with the totalitarian regimes in the former Soviet Union and China, statism, child killing on demand, anti-Christian, anti-liberty, coddling dictators and Islamic radicalism, etc., I see no reason to restrain ourselves from treating them accordingly. If these folks get their way, our entire civilization will be undone. We can't be a little bit pagan. We can't be a little bit statist. We're either the America we were founded to be, or we are not. One of the dumbest things in football is a receiver getting what's called alligator arms, which means the receiver didn't fully extend his arms to catch the ball because he anticipated he was going to get hit hard by the defensive player if he did. Except more often than not, the defensive player is behind the receiver, so he can't tell if he actually caught the ball or not. That's why defensive players are coached to hit the receiver anyway in anticipation of breaking up the pass. Thus, it's never made any sense to me why a receiver would get alligator arms, since he's going to get hit hard regardless. If you're going to get hit anyway, why not fully extend your arms to make the catch, to make the pain worth it? We need political soldiers who count the cost of not doing something at least as much as they count the cost of doing something. A receiver who counts the cost of getting hit gets alligator arms, but a receiver who counts the cost of not making the catch fully extends to make the play. Likewise, a politician who counts the cost of being criticized by those that will never support him anyway will buckle. But a politician who counts the cost of not defending constitutional principles will stand firm. That's why we never attack what we're not willing to kill. And it's one of the first commandments of political warfare. If you only shoot to injure your enemy, he doesn't try to kill you less once he heals and gets back on the battlefield because you didn't kill him the first time. No, he comes back with a vengeance. You will get no credit from him for showing restraint, so you might as well go for the metaphorical kill shot. See that as the win. If we do not learn and put into practice this commandment, then there's no need proceeding from here. Trying to fight a war without trying to win just makes things even worse. You're actually better off then doing nothing. If you're supporting a candidate or a cause that isn't willing to play to win, you're wasting your time as well as the future for your children and grandchildren. And time is the one thing they're not making more of.
And that was Chapter 5 of Rules for Patriots, How Conservatives Can Win Again by Steve Deese. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
Send my very warmest Christmas greetings to all of our Word on Fire family, all those who've used Word on Fire materials this past year, all those associated with us and our mission. So God bless all of you this holy season. And I want to share a quick little reflection with you on what I'm going to call the Jewishness of the Christmas stories. It's really impossible to read these great Christmas accounts in Luke and Matthew without attending to the very rich history of Israel out of which they come. I'll give you just three examples, all Marian. So the first one, we talk about the Annunciation, when the angel announces to Mary she'll be the mother of the Lord. And what does the angel say? Well, you'll be mother of this Most High, he will be called Great. And then the angel says, he'll be given the throne of David, his father, and his reign will be without end. Well, what is that? That's an explicit reference to 2 Samuel 7, the prophecy of Nathan to David, where the Lord says, I'm going to build you a house, David. It'll last forever, and a descendant of yours will sit on this throne forever. We know the Davidic line ended at the Babylonian captivity about 500 years before the time of Jesus. It ended. And yet the angel says, this prophecy is still going to come true, and this one will be the descendant of David who will reign forever. We won't understand the meaning of Jesus without seeing him as the fulfillment of that prophecy. Here's a second Marian reference. We speak of the visitation, when she goes in haste after the Annunciation into the hill country of Judah to visit her cousin. Well, the attentive Jewish reader in the first century, when he heard hill country of Judah, you know what he was thinking about? In the story of the Ark of the Covenant, when Israel lost the Ark of the Covenant, it ended up, it's a long story, but ended up in the hill country of Judah. And David went there to fetch it, and then he brought it back to Jerusalem, dancing with reckless abandon before it. What do we find now? Mary goes to the hill country of Judah. Now, why? Because she is the true Ark of the Covenant. If the Ark of the Covenant held the remnants of the tablets of the Ten Commandments, Mary holds within her womb the very presence of the Lord. So she's the true Ark of the Covenant in the hill country of Judah. More to it, John the Baptist, his mother says, the minute your greeting sounded in my ears, the baby leapt in my womb for joy. Well, who is the infant John the Baptist but a new David, doing his exuberant dance in the presence of the Ark of the Covenant? Last Marian reference, what we call the presentation. So Joseph and Mary bring the child Jesus into the temple. This is the fulfillment of the prophet Ezekiel. Go back to Ezekiel chapter 10. The corruption of the temple had become so great, idolatry and all sorts of bad practices were going on. So it says that the Shekinah, which means the glory of the Lord, up and left the temple. It's one of the saddest, most disturbing passages in the whole Old Testament. God's glory has left his temple. And there's no account, mind you, in the Old Testament of it ever coming back. The child Jesus being brought into the temple by Mary, who symbolizes the Ark of the Covenant, signals the return of the Shekinah, the return of the glory of the Lord to his holy place. Now, my point here, friends, and we could go on and on with these stories. Every aspect of the Christmas stories are filled with the Old Testament. Think even of the three kings coming from a distant land to honor the newborn king. What is that but the fulfillment of Isaiah chapter 60? They will come with dromedaries and camels from a distant land to worship the Messiah. It's the fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. My point is, you can't read these Christmas stories apart from the Old Testament. The Old Testament now opens up their depth, their luminosity, and their meaning to us. So I might recommend this Christmas, go back to those sources. Read these stories with fresh eyes in light of the Old Testament. And again, a very blessed, very happy Christmas to the whole Word on Fire family. God bless you.
And that was Bishop Robert Barron. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, like every form of determinism, racism invalidates the specific attribute which distinguishes man from all other living species, his rational faculty. Racism negates two aspects of man's life, reason and choice, or mind and morality, replacing them with chemical predestination. Unquote. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, more of the 33 strategies of war.
Only then did he hit them with a speech that brought home their precarious reality and swayed their emotions. At Cannae, a one-line joke had the same effect. Instead of trying to persuade the troops of his confidence, Hannibal showed it to them. Even as they laughed at the joke about Gisco, they bonded over it and understood its inner meaning. No need for a speech. Hannibal knew that subtle changes in his men's mood could spell the difference between victory and defeat. Like Hannibal, you must aim indirectly at people's emotions. Get them to laugh or cry over something that seems unrelated to you or to the issue at hand. Emotions are contagious. They bring people together and make them bond. Then you can play them like a piano, moving them from one emotion to the other. Oratory and eloquent pleas only irritate and insult us. We see right through them. Motivation is subtler than that. By advancing indirectly, setting up your emotional appeal, you will get inside instead of just scratching the surface. 4. In the 1930s and 40s, the Green Bay Packers were one of the most successful teams in professional football. But by the late 50s, they were the worst. What went wrong? The team had many talented players, like the former All-American Paul Hornung. The owners cared about it deeply and kept hiring new coaches, new players, but nothing could slow the fall. The players tried. They hated losing. And really, they weren't that bad. They came close to winning many of the games they lost. So what could they do about it? The Packers hit bottom in 1958. For the 1959 season, they tried the usual trick, bringing in a new coach and general manager, Vince Lombardi. The players mostly didn't know much about the man, except that he had been an assistant coach for the New York Giants. As the players convened to meet the new coach, they expected the typical speech. This is the year to turn things around. I'm going to get tough with you. No more business as usual. Lombardi did not disappoint them. In a quiet, forceful tone, he explained a new set of rules and code of conduct. But a few players noticed something different about Lombardi. He oozed confidence. No shouts, no demands. His tone and manner suggested that the Packers were already a winning team. They just had to live up to it. Was he an idiot or some kind of visionary? Then came the practices, and once again, the difference was not so much how they were conducted as the spirit behind them. They felt different. They were shorter, but more physically demanding, almost to the point of torture. And they were intense, with the same simple plays endlessly repeated. Unlike other coaches, Lombardi explained what he was doing, installing a simpler system based not on novelty and surprise, but on efficient execution. The players had to concentrate intensely. The slightest mistake and they were doing extra laps, or making the whole team do extra laps. And Lombardi changed the drills constantly. The players were never bored and could never relax their mental focus. Earlier coaches had always treated a few players differently. The stars. They had a bit of an attitude and they took off early and stayed up late. The other men had come to accept this as part of the pecking order, but deep down, they resented it. Lombardi, though, had no favorites. For him, there were no stars. Coach Lombardi is very fair, said defensive tackle Henry Jordan. He treats us all the same, like dogs. The players liked that. They enjoyed seeing Hornung yelled at and disciplined just as much as the others. Lombardi's criticisms were relentless and got under his players' skins. He seemed to know their weak points, their insecurities. How did he know, for instance, that Jordan hated to be criticized in front of the others? Lombardi exploited his fear of public lashings to make him try harder. We were always trying to show Lombardi he was wrong, commented one player. That was his psyche. The practices grew more intense still. The players had never worked this hard in their lives, yet they found themselves showing up earlier and staying later. By the season's first game, Lombardi had prepared them for every contingency. Sick of training, they were grateful to be playing in a real game at last, and to their surprise, all that work made the game a lot easier. They were more prepared than the other team, and less tired in the fourth quarter. They won their first 3 games. With this sudden success, their morale and confidence soared. The Packers finished the year with a 7-5 record, a remarkable turnaround from 1958's 1-10-1. After one season under Lombardi, they had become the most tight-knit team in professional sports. No one wanted to leave the Packers. In 1960, they reached the championship game, and in 1961, they won it, with many more to follow. Over the years, various of Lombardi's Packers would try to explain how he had transformed them, but none of them could really say how he had pulled it off. Interpretation. When Vince Lombardi took over the Packers, he recognized the problem right away. The team was infected with adolescent defeatism. Teenagers will often strike a pose that is simultaneously rebellious and lackadaisical. It's a way of staying in place. Trying harder brings more risk of failure, which they cannot handle, so they lower their expectations, finding nobility in slacking off and mediocrity. Losing hurts less when they embrace it. Groups can get infected with this spirit without realizing it. All they need is a few setbacks, a few adolescent-minded individuals, and slowly, expectations lower and defeatism sets in. The leader who tries to change the group's spirit directly, yelling, demanding, disciplining, actually plays into the teenage dynamic and reinforces the desire to rebel. Lombardi was a motivational genius who saw everything in psychological terms. To him, the National Football League teams were virtually equal in talent. The differences lay in attitude and morale. Reversing the Packers' defeatism would translate into wins, which would lift their morale, which in turn would bring them more wins. Lombardi knew he had to approach his players indirectly, had to trick them into changing. He began with a show of confidence, talking as if he assumed they were winners who had fallen on bad times. That got under their skins, far more than they realized. Then, in his practices, Lombardi didn't make demands, a defensive, whiny approach that betrays insecurity. Instead, he changed the practice's spirit, making them quiet, intense, focused, workmanlike. He knew that willpower is tied to what you believe possible. Expand that belief, and you try harder. Lombardi created a better team, which won its first game, by making its players see possibilities. Defeat was no longer comfortable. Understand. A group has a collective personality that hardens over time, and sometimes that personality is dysfunctional or adolescent. Changing it is difficult. People prefer what they know, even if it doesn't work. If you lead this kind of group, do not play into its negative dynamic. Announcing intentions and making demands will leave people defensive and feeling like children. Like Lombardi, play the wily parent. Ask more of them. Expect them to work like adults. Quietly alter the spirit with which things are done. Emphasize efficiency. Anybody can be efficient. It isn't a question of talent. Efficiency breeds success, and success raises morale. Once the spirit and personality of the group start to shift, everything else will fall into place. 5. In April 1796, the 26-year-old Napoleon Bonaparte was named commander of the French forces fighting the Austrians in Italy. For many officers, his appointment was something of a joke. They saw their new leader as too short, too young, too inexperienced, and even too badly groomed to play the part of general. His soldiers, too, were underpaid, underfed, and increasingly disillusioned with the cause they were fighting for, the French Revolution. In the first few weeks of the campaign, Napoleon did what he could to make them fight harder, but they were largely resistant to him. On May 10th, Napoleon and his weary forces came to the bridge of Lodi over the river Adda. Despite his uphill struggle with his troops, he had the Austrians in retreat, but the bridge was a natural place to take a stand, and they had manned it with soldiers on either side and with well-placed artillery. Taking the bridge would be costly, but suddenly the French soldiers saw Napoleon riding up in front of them in a position of extreme personal risk, directing the attack. He delivered a stirring speech, then launched his grenadiers at the Austrian lines to cries of "Vive la République!" Caught up in the spirit, his senior officers led the charge. The French took the bridge, and now, after this relatively minor operation, Napoleon's troops suddenly saw him as a different man. In fond recognition of his courage, they gave him a nickname, Le Petit Caporal. The story of Napoleon facing the enemy at the Bridge of Lodi passed through the ranks. As the campaign wore on, and Napoleon won victory after victory, a bond developed between the soldiers and their general that went beyond mere affection.
And that was the next part of Chapter 7, Transforming Your War into a Crusade from the 33 Strategies of War by Robert Greene. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the enemies of my country.
24. Wei Zhao approached the bow of his yacht, stopping at the rail to let the salty breeze whip across his half-buttoned linen shirt. He came out here often during his passages to think, to focus, to appraise the world behind mirrored sunglasses. From this leading edge of his yacht, he had a sense of acceleration, of limitless opportunity. The horizon was an endless expanse of rolling blue ocean, the seascape both invigorating and humbling. On land, he was a billionaire, a business magnate surrounded most of the time by an entourage of assistants and colleagues. But out here, he was a speck on the ocean, an infinitesimally small presence that Mother Nature could obliterate at any time. That was one of the reasons he liked going to sea and did it often, to remind himself of his mortality, to consider what really mattered in this world. Another reason, of course, was to enjoy his yacht. Named after Homer's six-headed sea monster, the Scylla was a 140-foot-long marvel of luxury yacht construction, one that had taken him 3 years and over $20 million to build. It was a completely custom project, designed with the aid of a famed naval architect and built by the Italian firm Patriots Limited. He'd commissioned the yacht with an eye to the essentials required for easy access, namely a helipad, as well as those required by cultural relevance, hence the square tables spread throughout the lounge for playing mahjong, the traditional Chinese tile game. There were also the water toys, jet skis, and scuba equipment, though they were largely reserved for his guests. Zhao had little interest in splashing around the water like a schoolboy on a family vacation. The same applied to the yacht's 10-guest capacity, only maximized when he was entertaining business prospects or loaning a charter to his most trusted colleagues. Zhao's primary consideration was speed, and he'd spared no effort in that regard. Powered by 2 Jedburgh diesel engines and a pair of Emmar gas turbines, the Scylla produced 18,700 horsepower and topped out at 67 knots, making it one of the fastest yachts in the world. He appreciated that speed. Contrary to many of his island-hopping billionaire counterparts, Zhao preferred long voyages in total privacy, preferably to far-flung lands with diverse dining and culture. And most often, he traveled with the company of what his Saudi counterparts in the business world referred to as their pleasure wives. These women were models and B-list actresses, usually with affinities for champagne and fine dining, diamonds and designer clothes. They weren't prostitutes, technically, at least. All were educated and dignified, carrying themselves with polished manners and quiet grace. They could all pass as a date or business colleague at any Michelin-starred restaurant in the world if he'd decided to take them. He never did, of course. Zhao preferred his temporary liaisons to occur on the seclusion of his yacht, generally finding his women through a network of fashion photographers who made personal referrals to the business elite and provided literal portfolios to aid in the selection. Zhao had little interest in Asian women, preferring long-legged Nordic types, those tall blondes with an ice queen style. He generally took 4 to 6 with him on his excursions, depending on availability and trip length. It wasn't that he needed the physical company. His sexual appetites were average at best, and unlike many of his colleagues, he didn't mistake any of the women's ego-boosting dialogue with him for any form of genuine enchantment. The reason was much simpler. He merely appreciated the view. An absurdly fast super yacht with 360-degree vistas of the sea or shore of his choice was a marvelous thing. But it was far more so when the deck was covered with nude or semi-nude women, usually draped in the jewelry he provided them unless they were sunbathing. Growing up in a poor and conservative region of China, Zhao had an upbringing devoid of many things he now enjoyed. Fine music, literature, even art. It was that latter point he considered the women typically present during his excursions to be. Because he slept with them, yes. But most of all, he employed them for the sheer aesthetic beauty they added to his voyages. And when those voyages were over, those women received their gifts in a currency of their choice. The unit of measure was a brick, or $40,000 in wrapped bills. 1 brick per day aboard the boat, the payments, and non-disclosure agreements taken care of by his crew. He turned at the bow to look at his ship, the sleek white surfaces and bulbous black windows wiped to a mirror shine by the constant efforts of the staff on board the yacht. But he was alone on the deck. There were no women on this voyage, no businessmen. This time it was just Zhao and his crew, a rare solo excursion, and a long one at that. With the wind at his back, Zhao saw his yacht captain exit the cabin door. The captain wore a pressed white shirt with traditional black shoulder boards, his eyes squinting in the sunshine until he covered them with aviator sunglasses. Locating Zhao, he strode across the bow until stopping at its apex. Raising his voice over the wind and waves, he spoke in Mandarin. "Sir, we are 10 miles out. There are no vessels on radar, and with your permission, I believe we can proceed as planned." Zhao raised an eyebrow. The captain smiled. "We have come a long way, haven't we?" "We have," Zhao said, "and we will go much further yet, brother." Then he turned to face the ocean before him, draping an arm around his captain's shoulders as the 2 men watched the rolling waves extending forward into the future, into oblivion. 25. Worthy adjusted his hands on the rifle between his legs, scanning out his back seat window for threats. Enemy observation posts, spotters with radios or cell phones monitoring the vehicle traffic following the route to Ibrahim Kel. And judging by the near-constant stream of conversation that had filled the ride so far, he seemed to be the only one paying attention to their surroundings. Ian asked, not for the first time, "You sure this is a good idea, David?" "Not really," he replied. "I mean, technically, what she said was, stand by for link-up and exfil. But what I heard was, reconnoiter for rocket location in advance of strike force arrival." And what if she didn't mean any of that? She did, I assure you. And if anyone has a problem with our actions, I'll say we got lost and stumbled into Ibrahim Kel by accident. Let me worry about that. You just put your brain to use figuring out what BK could possibly want to hit in Charlottesville. You should know better than me. What's worth attacking there? The zoo? No, David replied. Charlottesville doesn't have a zoo. Have to drive to Richmond for that. But it's got John Paul Jones Arena for basketball and concerts. That has a capacity of 15 grand. Scott Stadium, which can probably fit 50 or 60,000 people. Could be the university, but we're too late in the year for a VIP commencement address. And all that seems too lowball for that cargo he's got. Ian said, I just remembered. NGIC is in Charlottesville. What's NGIC? National Ground Intelligence Center. It's an Army-run unit specializing in science and tech with a focus on monitoring foreign ground forces. BK could make quite a statement by wiping out their headquarters. Elias said, I would like to propose another option. There is no attack on this date. What do you mean? The logistician said he overheard this information, not that they told him. It could be the date and location of a transfer for the cargo. Does this town have an airport? Yes, David said. Charlottesville has direct flights to Atlanta, Philly, New York, Chicago. D.C.? Elias asked. Yeah, I think there's a line to Washington Dulles. Perhaps you should consider this possibility. David leaned forward and said, Why haven't you thought of that, Ian? Why are you picking on me? Ian shot back. Worthy hasn't said anything so far, and he may not be smarter than me, but he's definitely smarter than you. Elias said, And what about me? Ian shrugged. Depends on whether your airport theory plays out, I suppose. Worthy finally spoke. With all you guys arguing over what BK's target is, one of us has got to pull some security. Besides, I'm not so sure Charlottesville isn't just a decoy anyway. Decoy for what? David asked beside him. Oh, I don't know. Maybe any major American city on the eastern seaboard? If I'm BK and I've got a rocket stockpile, I'm not wasting it on some dipshit town in the middle of Virginia. No offense, David. None taken. Ian consulted his GPS while steering, and then he transmitted, should be about 10 minutes out from Ibrahim Kel. Cancer's response was almost immediate, crackling over Worthy's earpiece. If we end up having to sling lead again, you bastards better step up. Already been twice in this country that I've had to swoop in and single-handedly save the day. David transmitted back, Yeah, thanks for all your service and sacrifice. It's a miracle you've survived long enough to be a candidate for lung cancer. No cancer with my genes. My dad made it to 92, smoking 2 packs a day since he was 15. I go through less than a pack tops, which means I'll probably live to 120. That's good math, David conceded. It's still disgusting. At least I'm not Ian. Truck 2 out. Behind the wheel, Ian asked, What's that supposed to mean? I did good back there at the checkpoint, didn't I? It wasn't terrible, David said after a brief pause. I mean, you could do worse than America says hello. Worthy commented, but you could do a whole lot better, too. Maybe some Godfather shit, like America sends her regards. Ooh, I like that. Yeah, Ian, maybe use that one at the next checkpoint. Ian shook his head. Well, if Worthy's one-liners are better, and his shooting is better, and he's quite a bit more handsome, Worthy interjected, then what the hell do you need me for? The truck occupants fell quiet then, conversation ceding to the rumble of engine and tires negotiating the path to Ibrahim Kel. Then Ian loudly cleared his throat. I said, then what do you need me for? Hang on, David replied. I'm thinking. Wait, that's it. We'll come to a point where actual thinking is required. You seem to do that better than any of us. Worthy said, Except Elias. Elias gave a silent shrug as if this much were obvious, and David continued, well, yeah, except him. He's pretty good at it too. And only when there's no pressure involved, like the risk of imminent death. In those circumstances, no Elias and no pressure, you're absolutely indispensable, Ian. The driver fell silent again, probably deciding that he wasn't going to win any verbal battles. For all his intelligence, he was trampled underfoot when it came to the shit-talking abilities of everyone else on the team. Worthy had no problem joining in the banter, and poking fun at Ian was always a good time. But he knew that, right now, the humor was largely a guise to conceal the reality of their circumstances. The team's supplies were limited to what they had jumped into Syria, bearing dire implications where ammunition was concerned. Despite cross-loading the remaining ammo among the team, each man was down to a few magazines for their organic weapons. They'd mitigated that with a battlefield resupply of captured ISIS weapons and ammunition from the checkpoint, but resorting to local weapons represented a desperate last resort. And the fact that none of them had been wounded or killed in the previous 3 engagements, exactly none of which had gone as planned, was less a credit to their skills than it was to the enemy's ineptitudes. Even wild, undisciplined, and untrained fighters got lucky, and they could miss 99% of the shots they took and still succeed in killing one or more members of the American team that didn't have any men to spare. Sure, the Delta guys who would be arriving to back them up faced the same risks, but they were fully equipped and had quick response forces standing by, to say nothing of access to emergency medical evacuation flights and pre-staged resupply waiting to be delivered if they got pinned down. They also had the manpower and organization suited for the job they were asked to do. Worthy's team, by contrast, was like a scalpel being employed where an axe was required because no other tools were available. Hell, he thought, at this point they probably owed their survival to Elias. His convincing radio transmission at the checkpoint was probably the only reason Bari Khan hadn't sent another wave of fighters to stop them, effectively severing any suspicion that the 5 Americans had survived and were far closer to the cargo than any of the Special Operations Forces currently tied up with their move from Sepaya. A transmission sounded over the truck's radio console, a voice speaking in Arabic followed by a short response. "Anything?" David asked. Elias gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "They are saying security is good. That is all. I will tell you when these savages say something useful to our purposes." Worthy frowned. They'd overheard periodic transmissions throughout the drive, but thus far none had been useful to them, and he wondered if any would before Delta's arrival to the team's destination. His contemplation ended the moment he caught a glimpse of the buildings ahead. At that second, he had no doubt that they were arriving at Ibrahim Kell. I watched the surroundings pass by with a sense of disbelief. The scope of destruction in Ibrahim Kell defied my ability to comprehend it. I'd seen war-ravaged lands before, of course, namely in Iraq and Afghanistan. Syria was a similarly ancient land. The capital of Damascus was the oldest continuously populated city in human history. But Ibrahim Kell was a once bustling city that had been transformed into a scene that was, to put it lightly, post-apocalyptic. I was reminded of the World War II images of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, grainy black and white snapshots of half-standing buildings rising from an endless landscape of destruction. But the sight before me wasn't the result of a marvel of technology being strategically employed to end a vast global war. These buildings, this city, the entire country had been beaten down by human hands operating relatively primitive weapons, artillery, mortars, rockets, with such incredible consistency that it looked like a vast reconstruction project had been abandoned midway through, leaving in its wake expanses of loose brick, exposed concrete siding, scrap material, and garbage strewn across the ground between buildings. The truth, of course, was that those buildings had once been whole and functioning structures. I looked to a pile of twisted metal sheeting stacked nearly 15 feet high, wondering where the hell it had come from. It was impossible to discern. Trying to imagine how this city appeared before the Civil War was like picturing a man's living appearance by looking at his skeleton. And, I thought, that's what this region had devolved to. The skeletal remains of a once functioning society. The strikes of countless bullets gave a blanket acne appearance to every painted surface, once intact walls now as cratered as the surface of the moon. To my left was an 8-story former apartment building with its entire front wall missing, revealing an X-ray view of dozens of abandoned rooms that looked like dark spider holes. How many families had it once housed? Where had they gone? There was no way to tell, no hope of juxtaposing logic of any kind against the backdrop of what we were seeing. Virtually nothing was untouched by war. A building with an otherwise intact facade nonetheless bore a jagged hole big enough to drive a truck through, a black cyclops eye, marking the path of some long-forgotten artillery round impacting at random. Roof lines had been chipped away by explosions. Partially intact balconies were marked by bent and misshapen railings. Interior stairways were visible through missing walls, entire buildings charred and blackened by explosion and flame. Yet the civilians I saw were carrying on with life, holding their heads high. I saw children playing atop piles of rubble, scampering up slabs of concrete that had once been walls. People were riding bicycles, wearing backpacks and carrying bags of food and supplies, seeming oblivious to the destruction around them. How they could exist with hope under these circumstances was almost beyond comprehension. The few who looked at our trucks turned their gaze away just as quickly, trying to hide their dismay with varying degrees of success. They weren't looking to us as tacit allies in the plight against their oppressors. To them, we were the oppressors. There was a fair amount of vehicle traffic through the town, though every car and truck appeared to belong to civilians. So far, we were the only idiots cruising down the streets in marked ISIS vehicles, and I feared we'd take a rocket through the windshield from some resistance group waiting in ambush. Ian asked, "Where do you want me to go?" "Just follow the car to our front. Let's stay with the flow of traffic to get our bearings." He did so, carving a left-hand turn after a battered white sedan. As soon as we completed the turn, however, no more civilians could be seen. In fact, there was no traffic at all. We'd just entered enemy territory. Elias spoke. "We are lucky for these trucks. Look to our right." I saw instantly what he was talking about. A trio of men were standing behind a partial wall on the second floor of a devastated building, and one of them was holding the unmistakable cone of a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. But he didn't shoot at us or the car to our front, and I wondered what in the hell he was waiting for. Ian continued following the sedan, and for a moment I felt bad for the local driver, probably checking his rearview mirror to see the pair of ISIS vehicles trailing him through a second turn in the Syrian nightmare equivalent of being tailed by a cop who you expected to pull you over at any second. Sure enough, the car swung a hard right turn, disappearing into a short side street ending in an iron gate. To my surprise, the gate was manned by a cluster of armed men. Two of them grabbed the gate's opposing doors, swinging them open for the vehicle to enter an open courtyard in the compound before we passed the side street and the scene vanished from view. "Elias?" I asked. "Who were those guys?" He gave an amused grunt. "Take your pick." I knew exactly what he meant. At this point in the Civil War, there were so many armed militia groups that it became difficult, if not impossible, to tell them apart. A rifle-toting man could be a member of the Syrian armed forces, pro- or anti-government militia, ISIS, Hezbollah, and we satisfied ourselves by assuming everyone with a weapon was hostile. But the fact that they hadn't reacted to the sight of our trucks indicated they were either ISIS or an ally, and there was no shortage of either in Ibrahim Kel. Ian abruptly slammed a fist atop the steering wheel. "Shit, David, that gate, that's where the rockets are. It's been staring me in the face this entire time, and I didn't even see it." I was taken aback by his outburst. Whatever's behind that gate could be one of a dozen enemy strongholds in this city. "It's not about the gate," Ian insisted. "It's about the sedan that just pulled in. When we hit that ISIS checkpoint just over an hour ago, there were 6 cars lined up. The guard questioned every driver, but he only searched a single pickup truck." "And that means what?" "It means that we didn't see 6 civilian vehicles. We saw 1. The rest were transport vehicles redirecting to Ibrahim Kel to load the rockets. BK isn't transferring the cargo to flatbeds or marked ISIS trucks that we can bomb. He's going to divide the rockets among regular cars that can blend into the normal traffic pattern and be indistinguishable from the air." Ian was a sharp guy, but I wasn't convinced. And the last thing we needed was to give Duchess false hope before we'd canvassed the entire city. She'd already launched a strike force into Sapaya upon receiving our previous transmission, and I didn't want to risk another expenditure of resources until we were certain. We have to be sure, Ian. I am sure. Think about it. In the time it took us to attack that checkpoint, clear the objective, and conduct our search, we didn't see a single additional vehicle pull up from either direction. No, Worthy said. We didn't. That's because we weren't looking at the first vehicles in the transport fleet. We were looking at the last. And that's just out of the ones redirecting from Sapaya to Ibrahim Cal. There's no telling how many already traveled here from other towns. I reached forward to tap Elias on the shoulder. What do you say, Mr. Syrian Intelligence? Elias said, I believe he may be correct. Ian spoke quickly, continuing to follow the street. I don't know how many cars BK is using, but the one that just entered has got to be one of the last. If we wait much longer, they're going to start coming back out. Even with air support, we couldn't follow them all. All right, I said. This has got airstrike written all over it. Let me see what Duchess has available. But as I prepared to transmit to Duchess, my words were halted by an incoming transmission. Not on my team's frequency or even the command net, but from the truck's radio console. It was another stream of Arabic, though this time Elias's reaction was notably different. He looked back at me and spoke quickly. The cars will leave in 5 minutes.
And that was chapters 24 and 25 of The Enemies of My Country by Jason Casper. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative in the United States. Today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there, and reminding you to be honest, smart, and beautiful, and remember that the left has no authority, no power, and they can't win.